Okay. Hi. Thanks so much for coming. I'm still kind of in that phase where I can't believe that people who don't know me personally come to stuff. So it's a surprise every time when I'm like, oh, there are people here. So I really appreciate it. And thank you so much for hosting us here. It's such a beautiful and important bookshop. I'm just going to read, not for long, for like, I think it's probably 5 or 6 minutes in total. I'll read a section from the curator and then a section from the king, just to kind of give you a sense of what kind of people they are, I suppose. So I will just do that. The curator's section is called, all of the sections have little titles, and this section is called My Great Lesson in Perspective. Around 3 years ago, while visiting a stunning property, I observed on the periphery of a distinctly mediocre kitchen table scene 3 grey plastic fish lying perfectly parallel to one another in a rectangular ceramic dish. The fish looked like something from the chew toy aisle of a pet store, one coloured, a seam visible at the belly, their fins not distinct entities but part of the same mould as the body. Their eyes were utterly dead, but not as eyes which had once held life. I waited until the room was empty, then I removed the fish and walked away with them in my bag. This was during what I now think of as my past life, towards the end of it in fact, and I can admit that the bluntness of this solution reflects something of my state at the time. My situation, the pain of it, was something I had no choice but to exist within, but the fish, how unacceptable they were in the scene, that I could do something about, so I curated. Back at home, I took the fish out of my bag, observed them lying lifeless on my bed, and put them away in a drawer. I uncovered them some weeks later and moved them again to a less visited cupboard, but the fact of their presence in the house persisted like a low hum. Eventually, I gifted them to the child of a friend. They were disproportionately huge in their play kitchen, and the friend seemed somewhat horrified by the scale of them, but the child was delighted. And the king section is a tiny bit longer and is called To Be Dirty. The king is alone praying in his chambers. There are 2 men positioned on the other side of the door, shuffling. Occasionally, one of them clears his throat, lifts his staff and resets it against the floor. The king's household think him very pious. So far, it's the only thing they can honestly say about him in the affirmative, so they say it loudly and often. They are testing this out as his defining identity in lieu of any better alternative. The king prays often in public. He knows what a praying person looks like and how they should behave. It is an easy part to play. He closes his eyes and mutters words he has known by heart his whole life. He strongly suspects that no one is listening. The king requests time alone in his chapel to commune with God. The quiet then is absolute, as if his entire head has been set in a room-sized jelly and no one may force him out. He also insists on being left alone to pray in his rooms when there is a break in the demands of his time. He uses this time to touch things that would otherwise be forbidden. He sweeps the ash from fireplaces. He starts carefully, cursing when he gets a speck or smudge on his cuff. Then he begins to worry less. What is more dirt on top of dirt? No one will dare to question him about the state of his clothes or of his person. Now there is black grit behind each of his fingernails. He spits on his hands before he tries to wipe them clean. Sometimes he puts a finger inside his nostril to feel its interior. His favourite thing, if one of his cats has jumped up and in through the window, is to wipe the crust from the corners of their eyes with his thumb, to feel their bellies for tiny scraps or seeds they've carried in from the garden. He places his nose next to their mouth and smells the stink of their breath. Sometimes when he's alone with his favourite cat and she jumps up to his lap, she butts her nose into his stomach, his neck. He cradles her as he has seen parents cradle their children. She is ash grey with one white ear and white front paws, as if in bed socks. He imagines that in this world there exists only the 2 of them, and she relies on him and him alone, never flinching at a sudden noise or movement. She lets her head be easy and her tail drape over his sleeve, her noises of contentment moving through his arm. It feels like pure joy. He was caught in this position by one of his attendants, perhaps 3 years ago, before he was king. Now the rumour has new life, as if it happened only yesterday. Walking through the main rooms at court, he is sure he feels the prickle of gossip in the air. The king is so mad for want of a child, he believes his cat to be one. Perhaps the queen tries to nurse it. Do you want to sit down? Feel free to grab seats if you want to, yeah.
Thank you so much for reading this beautiful episodic moments from the book. I would like to tell what this book is about first. So Maeve, We Feed the King moves between a contemporary curator and an obscure medieval king, between staged history and imagined life. So my first question would be, in the Observer interview, you describe fiction becoming possible for you after encountering formerly permissive novels like Percival Everett's The Trees, and realizing you could approach a novel as a very, very long prose poem. So in that shift, what did the novel form begin to offer to you, formally or emotionally, that poetry was no longer giving you at the moment?
That's a really good question. I had stopped writing poetry anyway. I hadn't written poetry for quite a long time because I just didn't have the compulsion. And I think if you don't feel compelled, you shouldn't, because it will be bad. So I hadn't written for quite a while, and then I think I'd shifted. I wrote my trampolining book, and that's kind of, again, I tricked myself into doing it by thinking this is just a really long poem as well. And that was interesting because it's probably slightly, it's shorter, it's much shorter, it's like 12,000 words, but that was a really interesting exercise in stretching out, keeping the same approach. So I think that's the main thing that's allowed me to write prose when I thought I never would be able to, is that, you know, when you write a poem, you don't know what's going to happen and you don't know where it will end up. I just did that with the books as well. I just thought that's a fine process, actually, just to allow it to happen as you write. So I kind of held on to that and did it with the novel as well, and just sort of trusted in that things would become clear at some point, which is not, I think, ideal, actually. It's probably better to plan if you can, but I couldn't. Yeah. So I really enjoyed the novel. The process of writing a novel was different, but also actually very, very similar to writing poetry for me. And it just lasted for much longer and required a lot more editing. But I really enjoyed, you know, with poetry, you can leave lots of space for readers. You don't have to be incredibly explicit. You can be, but you don't have to be about things. And I, again, kept the spirit of that when I was writing a novel, but it was really enjoyable to have the space and time to like think about character more and think about place and atmosphere and think about place and environment as a character in a way that maybe takes a bit of a backseat in poetry. Creating those worlds felt really interesting to me and something that I hadn't done that much in poetry, I suppose. So that felt very different, being sitting in these places for a really long time and having the space to write about them at length and be like, this can be as long as I want. Because there is a point with poetry where you're like, this is too long now, before it becomes a book length poem. So it's quite nice to be like, no, I can just keep going, and then learning when to stop and not just keep writing because you can. So it's a different exercise in like expansion and restraint, I suppose. But it's very similar, but also totally different.
Which is interesting because your novel is completely different from what you've written before and is deeply concerned with the limits of historical knowledge and what survives, what disappears, and what gets formalized as truth. When you were writing, what did imagination feel like responsibility rather than risk?
Yeah, that's a really good one. I think I remember really clearly when I was at school. I don't know if anyone else had this. And last time I said it at an event, I thought, oh, that's a very embarrassing thing to say. But I was studying history. It must have been GCSE or maybe A-level. And it must have been GCSE because it would be too embarrassing to be that old. But you have a moment where you realise that we were reading two accounts of the same thing, and they're like, why has this person said this and why has the other one said this? What could possibly be the motivation? And you have that sudden moment where you realise that people are putting themselves hugely in their recordings of things and putting their biases in them. And I remember so clearly that being like, it's so silly. So you're like, oh, of course a German soldier has written a very different account to this person. But I really remember being like, okay, you really can't trust anything anyone has written ever about the past. And I became really, really interested in that that idea that you have to be really skeptical and you have to be really careful. And particularly now when things are just so like utterly fucked across the board, and you're like nothing, which is fake news and the lack of truth is totally different, but it's the same kind of concern, right, where you're like, okay, nothing, you have to approach absolutely everything with a sense of the context and the story and the time. So I wanted in the book to kind of balance having the space to like let imagination run wild, so my own but also readers. So like there's lots of space in the book, there are lots of unanswered questions, there are lots of like strands that could be correct, could not be, you have to kind of you can pick a path or not. So there's lots of room in it for readers to create their own world and make their own story and decide what they think is true and who they believe, if anybody. So I wanted to do that at the same time as being really like upfront about the artifice of the book and the fact that it's not historical fiction at all. It's not retelling a story of anything that happened, but I wanted it to feel like it was retelling the story of something that happened. Yeah. So kind of, I've come up with a slightly clumsy way of thinking about it, at least, which is that, so in Hilary Mantel's Wreath lectures, she talks about historical fiction being like a painting with the brushstrokes left in, so being really, really upfront that this is not the truth, this is a story about something true. And I was like, oh yeah, that's interesting, is that what I wanted to do? And I was like, it isn't at all, because I very intentionally chose not to write a retelling of something and to kind of poke a bit at the genre. So I was thinking of it more like the plaque that you get next to the painting that describes the painting. So I was like, that's kind of how I feel about what the book was trying to do, describe the painting with the brushstrokes left in. Yeah. Does that answer your question?
It does.
Okay.
Yeah. I think like it's your unnamed female character who's a curator, who's the main character of the book. She says that the obsession with accuracy can be stifling. How do you balance fidelity to history with the need to create scenes that feel alive, sensuous, and true?
I kind of really dodged that by not choosing a place or time to set the book in. So but mostly because I don't find that particularly interesting. So the book has we don't know what country we're in. You can make there are some options, and it's probably one of those, but there's no specified place. We don't know what year it is. No one has a name. We don't know what religion people are practicing. It's all very kind of, it's familiar, but it's not like explicit, which was a really intentional choice for all sorts of reasons around mostly readers, again, being able to populate the world themselves, but also because I didn't really have much interest in becoming bogged down with saying like, this is 1570, therefore I need to be, somehow the focus of the accuracy being the point of it, and something that can be kind of unpicked as correct or not feels very kind of arbitrary to me. So I wanted more to create a sense of a time that you could believe in, and to have in that I hope like really vivid things you can hold on to. So I didn't want like a book that felt incredibly vague or not visual or vivid. I wanted to be like, this is a really specific thing you can hold on to, this detail, and then the rest of it your brain can do what you want. So I basically didn't have to worry too much about fidelity. I kept a pretty sort of 150-year span in my head, just so I wasn't sort of putting LED lights in or anything ridiculous. So I was like, I was careful, and I was careful about words and the things that would have been around, but I also didn't. I just was like, I don't know if it's interesting to. I really admire people who do it. And when it's done well, it's like so evocative and brilliant, but that wasn't really what I was trying to get to work towards, I think.
Yeah. It feels like almost the vignettes of silences in a way of like liminal spaces, because it's almost, you write in short paragraphs, but sometimes it can be long and descriptive and beautiful. And at the same time, it kind of, it switches almost like non-linear, which is the way it's supposed to be.
Well, that's how remembering is, right? And how piecing together stories can be like either ones you're remembering or ones you're trying to kind of understand. And I like the idea that again, when you're sort of moving around, I wanted it to feel like a reader, like you're kind of moving around a place and you're catching things in snatches or at weird angles or through doors, like cracks in doors. So for it to feel like you're, grasping at a chunk sometimes and then at like a sentence other times, and just sort of trying to piece a story together, because, stories don't really appear to us start to finish in very nice, neat paragraphs, generally speaking. So, and I'm interested in that like liminality and the spaces between things and the areas between rooms and the things that happen in those gaps are kind of interesting.
Yeah, which is, it's kind of like my follow-up to the next question, that your novel is full of strange perspectives through windows, chests, and future past. What draws you to this title, Angles of Vision, and how do they resist conventional historical storytelling?
I was surprised to learn something about myself in a review where I think it was The Guardian, the reviewer said, it's no coincidence that this writer grew up trampolining, but you can really tell that everything is captured in like upside down and in a quick, and I was like, oh, I didn't know that.
That was beautiful, yeah.
It was amazing, and I felt very like incredibly embarrassed not to have ever thought that about myself, but also it felt very like an intimate thing for a reviewer to say. And I'm not saying like, it may not be true and I may never have even noticed it, but it made me suddenly be like, oh, I did spend like 15 years of my life, like a lot of the time, like really huge amounts of my time in strange, like up in the air. And like, I remember so clearly things like if you're doing a certain move and you're always at a certain point in the twist, you'll see the exact point of the room and there'll be a different person in it each time. And I'd always keep an eye on the door and see who was coming in, mostly because I had a coach I was terrified of, and I'd be like, is she coming in? And there would be a clock above it. And I had these really, really vivid recollections of these things. So I wonder how much that has to do with it. Like, I think maybe partly, so that was interesting to learn. But I think I wanted to situate the reader in a place where they felt like they were not just receiving a story. Because when you're reading a book, you're like, I'm being told a story, you're very, very aware that you're entering into this agreement where it's completely artificial. But I still wanted it to be like, you're entering this world and you're not just sitting in this chair and having it given to you bit by bit, that you're somehow moving through the space and collecting it yourself. But kind of, the first draft was felt more like the curator character was, with each passing day, she would have access to a new part of the palace, a bit like a computer game. Like she would be able to get to new areas of it, which I think I retained a little bit. So I like the idea of somebody suddenly being in the trunk where they can like peek out and spy on something. Like you've unlocked a new area. So that definitely stayed in my head as well. But yeah, just that kind of, that idea of having a unique, like there's some where you're like hovering outside a window. So things you could never actually practically do. But what that does, maybe that's more interesting as a reading experience. I don't know, to be in these places, but also just on a very basic level, kind of that sense of gossip and people spying on each other, which is what's happening, and everyone's whispering and you sense a sound and you think someone's there and they've just passed by. So that kind of feeling as well of always feeling like people are being watched by somebody, but it's often us, the reader, doing the watching.
Kind of like distanced and voyeuristic.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And voyeurism is really important as well, because all of the like sexual scenes are reported. None of them are actually happening. None of them are written from the perspective of like people involved in them. They're all seen by somebody else, like through a window or a crack in a door. So like voyeurism is really important. Pretty much everything we learn is reported by somebody else to the book.
Now I want to talk about the food in the book, like from bowls of fruit to half-eaten peaches, small domestic details. They seem to act like as a portal to other people's lives and past. So what can objects do to that narrative cannot explain?
What objects? Sorry.
What objects can do that narrative explanation cannot?
What can objects do that narrative? these questions are too good. They're too good. No one's asked me things like this before.
It's good.
It's good. It's really good. I think so. Again, I guess to go back to poetry, when you start, there'll be people I know who probably write poetry as well, but like object poetry is something that you kind of end up starting with, and I always was really drawn to object poetry and the idea, like sometimes someone just plop a thing in the middle of the table and you spend a whole session describing it, which is really important, but then also doing other things with it and imagining a life for it and imagining scenes for it. So I think I've always had that experience when I've gone to houses, whenever things have been set up, whenever scenes have been set up, there's something about them for me that's always just made me feel quite weird, which other people have also said happens to them. So I know I'm not alone. When you kind of enter a room and something's set up and ready, and you instantly are like, I can feel the story of this, or I can at least feel the story you're creating. And I think it's something about objects of being so visual. Obviously, they give you instantly those kinds of cues, and you're able to just take them and like, I guess, transport them in your imagination to wherever you want them to be, and whatever you can imagine them in any kind of environment. And I suppose in the book, because there are lots of descriptions of food, and in the first half, the first kind of third, where we're in the contemporary part, the curator loses her appetite. So as soon as she starts working on this installation, her appetite goes, and we sort of pull away from, we have lots and lots of descriptions of fake food, which she's kind of obsessed with the quality of, and we pull away completely from real food. And then we enter the medieval section, and the king is very depressed and has no appetite, and they're trying to feed him lots, and he has no interest in real food either. And then the descriptions of food, while they're really real, start to become a bit more uncanny as well, and a bit more feeling like they might be faking a bit of a painting. So I wanted the food to have, I guess, lots of different roles in the book, in terms of mapping onto people's appetites and people's desires or lack thereof, but also to be, again, kind of waving a bit of a flag that none of it is real. None of this is real. Even the food that appears to be real is not. And then they can switch so easily for being like something like a fake chicken leg with the maker's mark on it. I'm quite bad at talking about food in the book. This happens every time. Well,
the book has really, like, sometimes very short and sometimes long descriptions of food, fake one, and I think I want to talk about these two characters, the king and the curator. They're both kind of shaped by what they cannot fully articulate, kind of like unnamed tragedy, minimized records, and single pages in archives. How does silence function in a novel, as a loss, protection, or resistance?
Yeah, I think silence is really important, and I think the most important to me things that happen in the novel happen when people are kind of alone by themselves in a room. And we have, so the context, I guess, is that the curator is recovering from some kind of great rupture in her life that we don't find out about. But she's very isolated. She spends a lot of time in her home, really uneasy in the space, really not enjoying it at all. And then the king also is incredibly reluctant. This would have been helpful for me to say at the beginning. The king is the third in line, didn't expect this, is deeply unhappy, doesn't want the power that comes with it, is not interested in cooperating at all with what's expected of him, and just wants to be left alone essentially all the time. He just wants to be by himself. Like even his wife is in a relationship with somebody else, which he's fine with, and he's just like, I'm fine to be by myself in these rooms. So I think we learn probably the most intimate stuff I think we learn about the characters, or I wanted to communicate, is when they're alone. So like the first time I think that a reader would realise that the curator is losing herself to this other world is when she's like at home in bed alone and wakes, and she suddenly thinks she can hear the noise of him in the adjacent room, of the king in the adjacent room. So like the first time the silence punctuated, it's by him, and you think like, oh, something's up. I think she's on a one track to losing it. And yeah, same for the king. Like he's there's lots of dialogue where it's being thrown at him and he's constantly under attack, and people are saying things to him all the time and telling him he must do stuff and moving him around and putting him down, and he just like, even to the point of wanting to, like, pretending to be asleep so no one wakes him up and speaks to him. Basically, they're just both people who are ultimately like so at odds with their situations that they want to exist alone and in silence, but ultimately that changes, I suppose, for both of them, and becomes less of a central concern.
I think I want to give the shout out to Granta and to Al Housmans to make this event happening. And also, I think I would love to include some questions about fiction in general, how we write right now, and what feels radical to you now, like subject matter, form, or refusal of clarity, or something else entirely.
I think as a reader, and you said at the beginning how I had mentioned that it was reading certain books that weren't paying huge amounts of attention to form that made me think, I mean, they've existed for obviously forever, but I think there's been a more of a shift in the last few years around actually platforming work that isn't sitting in one space. And I think that's what I find most interesting. I don't know if necessarily radical, but I find that most interesting, like refusal of form. And even like, I loved studying so much, and I just studied poetry when I was at university and doing my master's, and you really like the received, the truth was you pick one or the other, and if you go to the other one, it's like a terrible betrayal of your craft. And I kind of was like, yeah, that's absolutely true, like boo to prose. And then you start to be like, this is complete fabrication. And actually the most interesting stuff, I think, including books like yours, are works where you'd open them and be like, this would be a nightmare for a bookseller to put on a shelf. That's pretty much probably where you're going to get the most interesting stuff, I think. Stuff that's just led by its central concerns and its heart, rather than plotting things along or being distinct. I mean, they can be brilliant, obviously, but things that are moving across form are just the best, I think.
I mean, I think as the global order kind of dissolves and violence becomes more kind of spectacular in a negative sense, should fiction disrupt our desire for coherence and meaning?
I mean, I think it should. Like, I don't know if it does always. I think it's tricky because I've never done any work on processing this thinking. I'm literally saying it now, so we'll see. But at the moment, it's the National Year of Reading, and I know this because the charity I work for is delivering the National Year of Reading, and it's great in so many ways, and it's meant to be very like expanding what literacy means and making it less book centric and making it focusing on audio, all this stuff. But the central message still is very about escapism and books taking you to other places. And I also work in prisons for my job. Like we run like creative literacy projects in prisons, and that's kind of again the central thing that comes up over and over again. People want to be removed from the environment they find themselves in, completely understandably, in prison. And it's that's the work of fiction for people in certain environments completely. And I think that's like the most powerful thing. However, I worry maybe that we can't be too distracted from the reality that we find ourselves in, because it's so bad, and like there's a lot of work that needs to be done, unfortunately, engaging with, like, I'm literally sitting here staring at Israel-Palestine on a table, and like there's so much work that you need to do, and arguably, depending how you feel about it, is the work of writers and artists to do. And like when I was writing the book, even though I was more and more interested in power as I wrote it, because of what was unfolding at the time, like mostly 2022, 2023, and into 2024 I was even writing it. So yeah, I was kind of like really preoccupied, and I was very aware that global events were seeping into my writing, and it was making me even more like stubborn about the fact that my king would absolutely not do any of these awful things. Like it was, and I was quite surprised by how much that affected maybe characterization and things like that. So I think it is, also important to very much have an eye on what's going on and not dissolve into books completely, but also they can do incredible things for people and speak truths kind of obliquely, rather than, they have a different job to do.
I think it's interesting because we cannot really close our eyes on some genocides or wars or something's happening around the world, because we're always media centered. We're always seeing it like on our screens, phones, laptops, whatever. And I think the refusal of anything of that, it would be more like of a cynical point because of I think my last question.
Okay, I'm gonna keep my answer short. You remember?
So like, if fiction admits that it can never fully represent truth or history, does that limitation become political weakness or a tool of resisting totalizing fascist narratives? I know I've prepared.
You have prepared, and I haven't seen any of these questions.
I should have sent.
You should have sent, and then I could have appeared so much more intelligent than I. I don't really know if I think that fiction has a duty to truth at all. Like, I don't think it does, and I think that's the point. That was kind of part of the point of what I wanted to write. Was in some kind of really tiny way, and I don't mean it like no one's going to read this. This book will do nothing in terms of suddenly making people go, oh, maybe I should question what is true and what I'm believing and why. Like, that's clearly not going to happen. But I think even as you're doing something, believing it has the power to carry some kind of a message is not the right word either, but do you know what I mean? Like, it's got something at the heart, like some kind of core truth in it that feels important. And I think fiction can carry that at the same time as not being its job, not being to kind of accurately represent what's happening in a time. Like this, you wouldn't read this and be like, oh, that was happening at exactly the time of these two absolutely terrible things. You could read it in 40 years and be like, oh, this could be any one of the number of, I'm sure, other awful things that have happened by that point.
Like Financial Times review.
Exactly. So yeah, I don't think fiction has a duty to that at all. And I think it can be, acts of resistance kind of make an assumption that you think your book has influence or that anyone will even read it. But I think it's what the intention maybe is the thing rather than the output or the hope for it.
I think we'll move to the Q&A for the audience.
Okay. I don't envy anyone following up on Misha's questions.